This topic, Be'ezra Hashem, we're going to start off with thanking, first of all, the Wiesenfeld family who is joining us and who are sponsoring this evening, Doctors Leah and Alan Wiesenfeld, upon the yahrzeit of Leah's beloved father, Rabbi Marvin Balsam Pinchas Matisyahu Ben Yosef Mordechai Olav Hashalom, whose yahrzeit will be, I believe, this coming Motzei Shabbos. Be'ezra Hashem, Nishmosai Eden, he should have a continued aliyas neshama. And his hashpah, his continued influence, should only continue and expand as you watch the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Mrs. Balsam, with tremendous nachas in Gesund for many years to come. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so glad you could be here with us. Let's do a little bit of learning together. So our topic this evening is a fascinating topic. It's every year when it comes into the Megillah, I think it behooves us to focus on a different aspect, a different part of the Megillah. And being as this is a Nach Shir, we're going to focus on one aspect of Nach. So the aspect that we were just getting into just a few moments ago was the following: Esther and her culture. Esther really as a Jew, a Jewish Persian or a Persian Jew, which is part of the difficulty in this whole story. Is we're told in the second parak that we have Achashverosh is in this unbelievable moment of, in a drunken stupor, he executes his wife, and now, as opposed to fixing things, decides that the best way to solve the problem is to now bring all the maidens into Shushan for his own grotesque pleasure and ultimate marriage. And when the news reaches the individuals, and here's an example of when it reaches one individual family, one has to imagine what that family would be thinking when you hear that terrifying knock on the door, when you know that there's going to be this edict which is going to search every house. What do you do? How do you respond to a culture which is not just foreign, but a culture which is at odds, which is antagonistic to everything you stand for? So this is the debate that's going on, and we see a very specific action taken by this family. Here's what we hear. We're in the second parak, and this is before the Megillah gets loud. At this point in time, it's just at this point, there's no Hamans. We're just talking about the culture in Shushan in Persia. Vayhi bihi shamat devar hamelech v'dasai uvaykavetz na'aros rabois el Shushan abira el yad hegais tevatilakach Esther el beis hamelech. So now the edict goes out. All the young maidens are taken to the house of the king, or to the special palace under a man by the name of Haggai. El Yad Haggai is Shomer Anashim. And it describes how she finds favor in the eyes of all who see her. But the one thing that she withholds is Loihi Geda Esther in Pasuk Yud. She does not tell Es Amor, her people, Ve'es Moladata, her birth, Ki Mordechai Tziva Aleha Asher Loi Saged. Because Mordechai told her not to. And so you wonder what this piece of advice was for. Was this the general culture in their house? Sort of just don't speak to strangers? Was this the piece of advice necessary for her to survive the unknown? For we don't know how long this would even last. And if it is meant to be that piece of advice, why is this the piece of advice? Why would this necessarily guarantee or give some degree of success to Esther? So that's going to be the question, our opening perspective over here. It seems like a obvious fact, but if the more you think about it, the less likely I think we would be to give this advice to our daughter/niece in this situation, if this were us trying to protect the person being abducted by royal edict. So why is this the case? So I'd like to explore some of the Meforshim and just think about it in contemporary terms. Think about it in a culture which is foreign, which is complex to us. As an example, before we get to the earlier models of this, just a simple perspective that Rashi and the Ibn Ezra share, but from different sides. We're perhaps most commonly aware of Rashi's suggestion, where he says, what is the reason why he is telling the piece of advice he gives to his beloved niece, daughter, perhaps wife, depending on which version of Medrash we're looking at, is the Rashi tells us, Asher lo sagid. Why? Kedei she'amru shehi mimishpacha bezuya v'yeshalchuha. If she does not reveal her identity, they must think that she comes from some sort of, nebach, difficult background, and that's not going to be fitting for the king, so they'll throw her out. If they knew that she had royal blood, because ultimately Mordechai and Esther come from the family of Shimi, and ultimately Kish, Yeshimini, right, which is ultimately the family, go back, way back when, is the family of Shaul HaMelech. Knowing that would be more of a reason for her to, in fact, stand a chance of winning the heart or the prestige of the king. And so in order to avoid that, ultimately, Mordechai is telling her to hide this. So if you ask yourself, so what is Mordechai trying to do? He's really trying to manipulate the circumstances for the favorable outcome. And the favorable outcome is Esther will be rejected. Let's continue with our regular life. We don't need you. We don't want any grandeur. We don't want anything to do with you, O king. So that seems to be the way that Rashi understands it, which makes a whole lot of sense, which now explains why this is the parting message as the guards drag her out of the house, and Mordechai calls after her. The words of advice he gives her is, don't say where you come from. Right? People only refrain from telling where they come from, usually when there's a problem there. So let them think there's a problem. Let them think that there's some sort of compromised background. That's the way that Rashi suggests it. Now, that being the case, the Ibn Ezra actually flips it and says the opposite. Because you have to ask yourself on this Rashi, is to us coming from the yichus of Beis Shaul is a wonderful thing. And there are people who have great pride in their families as they show their family, their family genealogy on the wall, and they show how many generations there are from which figures in Jewish leadership and Torah leadership. But one has to ask oneself, is this really something that Achashverosh, a man who can't think beyond his next drink, is that something that really matters so much to him or not? So Ibn Ezra has a little bit of a different permutation on this, and he suggests in his second suggestion here, he says, Ulai im tagid shehi migalus Yehuda lo yikocheno Achashverosh. The opposite. If they find out that she's a Jew, then there's less of a likelihood. They're not going to, he won't take her. Now, let's think about that. So what does the Ibn Ezra really mean then? If she were to say, I'm a Jew, they would reject her. Dirty Jew, right? We don't want any Jews in Persian parliament. That's what the response would be. So therefore, what's Mordechai's advice really doing? It's also trying to manipulate the outcome, according to the Ibn Ezra. But in this case, the manipulation is on the opposite side. Here you have a tactful, we'll call it politician. Mordechai ultimately wants Esther to be taken, to be incorporated into the royal family for whatever reasons he has, perhaps knowing the future. But this is the way he's manipulating it. Rashi and Ibn Ezra essentially share in common one theme, and that is that Mordechai is trying to manipulate the outcome of the decision making by not telling. Now, according to Rashi, not telling is in fact is going to be a demerit to her. Whereas according to the Ibn Ezra, it is a merit to her. Whichever way, it comes from the same perspective of Mordechai trying to adjust how the decision-making process will in fact come. Two different perspectives within the same framework of thought. Okay, folks, just an interesting starting point. This is the question. Now, I'd like to just point out one interesting thing here that we can ask ourselves, and that is what would, I'm just going to put a mute for the background, but please feel free to jump in with questions at any point. Okay, so the question's like this. Excuse me. Here we are. Okay. So one question we could ask is the following: is that we can sort of transition this into our perspective on what we would do in our culture. We could ask the same question: is our Judaism something we're proud of, or is it something we're ashamed of? Is it something that we think those around of us would be proud of, those who are not of Jewish culture, or is it something which we think they would be ashamed of as well? These are the questions that Rashi and the Ibn Ezra are triggering. How important is it that we're proud of and openly proud of our culture? Is the question that is being raised over here when it comes to Mordechai and Esther. But let's take it one step further as well. You'll notice that this is not the first time that people of the nation of Israel are a little bit hesitant about talking too much about their mishpacha, about their family. So as an example, if we go back to our greats, in Avram Avinu and Sarah, Avram and Sarah are making their way down to Egypt in a famine, and Avram already starts, playing a little bit with the relationship there. So he tells at the beginning of Lech Lecha, he says to Sarah, Imri na'achosiat, please say you're my sister. Somehow he doesn't want to be exactly upfront about the relationship they have. Now that's because of the immorality of the land of Egypt. But one can already start hearing this manipulation about how and who you are is central to the success of this next moment. In fact, it shouldn't be a surprise that the Midrash Rabbi Akiva actually related the fact that Sarah lived to 127 years is connected to the 127 countries that Esther ultimately became queen over. Meaning to say they shared something. Maybe they didn't just share in common the number 127. Maybe they also shared the fact that somehow their identity was veiled as they entered into dark situations, later to be the one who arises as a heroine in a complex environment. One should think about that as well. As a later point, when it comes to Yitzhak, when he is going into the diaspora reality, again, all these are diaspora realities. So he is now going into the area of Gerar, which is the area of Gaza today, the Philistines are in control. We told Vayishalu Anshe Makom Lishtoi Vayomer Achosihi. Again, he asks Rivka, please don't tell your outright relationship. Don't say exactly your relationship to me. Why? In this case, Kiorei Lemor Ishti Penyarguni Anshe Makom Al Rivka. He was worried again about the immorality, the fact that there was no Yiras Elokim, that there was no fear of God, and ultimately it would lead to, God forbid, some sort of murder, perhaps, as well. So we see when our patriarchs and matriarchs entered into systems that were foreign, they were a little more careful about the way they expressed themselves in terms of their relationships. Now, each of these cases requires its own investigation, but suffice to say that this should be some sort of model. A similar kind of thing happens later on, not about wives and husbands, but when it came to the children of Yaakov Avinu. If you remember, when Yaakov Avinu sends down his sons to Egypt to go and get bread, to get sustenance, because the famine has struck the earth so terribly, what ends up happening is that he sends them down, and he sends all the brothers but Binyamin, so it's 10 brothers. Then, this viceroy, unbeknownst to them who's Yosef, takes captive one of the brothers, Shimon, incarcerates them, sends them back, and now they're trying to plead to Yaakov, their father, that they need to go back to Egypt. And Yaakov is very concerned. And here's what Yaakov says. Why did you tell him that you had a brother? Why did you tell this man that you're a brother that now is going to leverage you to bring this brother Binyamin down? And they explained to him that we didn't know, and he innocently asked us, and we just let that information out and without knowing that he would have this whole grand plan. But in the end of the day, what you see from here again is a reluctance in a foreign environment to be so open with the way that you describe who your family is and where you come from. So much so, in fact, that the Ha'emek Davar, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, on his commentary on the Chumash right there says, he says, Ksiv kan Shem Yisrael. Yaakov was called not Yaakov as he was in these years lacking prophecy, when his son Yosef had been abducted, but he was called Yisrael. Ki bo bekan lelamdom das ledoros, because this is a kernel of wisdom to be learned for all generations. What is that? Hab ledoros aboim asher yu bagolos, all the nations like ourselves who would be in a diaspora reality. V'amdu liyos nishpat lifnei adonim shelo ledaber yoser me'ateshuva ala sha'al. What he's saying is I'm telling you that the reason why this is codified in such a way under the name Israel is because it relates to every one of us. And that is that in a exile reality, we have to be a little careful. We have to trust and verify. We have to be a little more circumspect about what it is that we say and what it is that we don't say, and not to be so careful, not so open in offering pieces of advice which could come back, or pieces of information which could come back to hurt us. In the case of Avram and Yitzhak, it's about their relationship to their wife. In the case of Yaakov, it's about the fact that they had another brother. And pushing this forward, if you think about the same logic, when it comes to Mordechai and Esther, it's her relationship to her culture and her family. Be careful, says Mordechai, as a diaspora Jew, you have to be very careful about how open you are, how connected you are to that society as well. In fact, The Maharal, in his Pirush on the Megillah, called Or Chadash, says a very beautiful idea as well, similar to this idea. And he says the following: Mordechai Choshesh. There's an eighth source. Mordechai was concerned, Ki sheyiyu yereim ha'ulmois she'amalkot tigdal moladato al kol hasarim. They were concerned that if they knew that she was of Jewish origin, she would, in a nepotistic way, elevate all of her family and cousins and mechutanim and eineklach and the whole business. They're all going to be part of the Persian government soon. V'tashpil acherim, and thereby manipulated that the others of, we'll call it, the more pure Aryan Persian blood would be pushed out. What they're going to say, those Jews, they hate foreigners. They're going to use their power to push out all those natural Persians who made their way in this culture. And in fact seduce the king against those people. And they would definitely want a queen of their own culture. So they will set up, unfortunately, attacks on her, whether they be true or not, until she'll have the same end as Vashti, because, as we can see, whoever has the ear of Achashverosh seems to be winning at that moment in time, and if they can have that ear, they will get rid of her. So again, it comes down to the same reality, is as Jews in a foreign environment, it's just fascinating to watch. So many times Jews just really want to succeed in the foreign culture they're in, wherever it be. Ukraine, Romania, France, England, America, Australia, wherever the tides have washed the Jews up, all they want to do to that culture is just prove that they can be loyal subjects to their culture. And all that culture says to them is, we don't really trust that you're so loyal because you're going to just elevate your own and continue your own agenda, which unfortunately is a sad reality. It's a sad reality we have to contend with in exile. And what Mordechai's advice to her is play it low. Don't show all your cards. Don't necessarily emphasize the fact that you're Jewish, because these things come back to bite you. And I would add over here, if you want to add to the Maharal, let's say there would be a policy, a new tax policy, which requires more of a welfare state, and that's going to demand high tax bracket from, we'll call, middle class earning. Who are they going to all blame when that tax sets? It's the Jews. And Mordechai understands that reality. He understands the reality of being, on the one hand, a very hard-working and loyal citizen of the country you're in, but not overemphasizing the Judaism which people will ultimately emphasize, no matter what happens, whether it goes right or it goes wrong. A complex reality, a reality which is worth thinking about. Spinning off of that, perhaps another angle, Rav Soloveitchik suggests in there's recently, a few years ago, they came out with what's called Masoret Harav on a number of things, and on Megillas Esther, there's a beautiful pirush which is it's culled from other of his explanations or writings. And I think this is a very beautiful idea, which is something I think we can relate to very clearly today. He said the following: had Mordechai abandoned caution and adopted the attitude of the arrogant fool, had he let everybody know that he was related to the queen, he would have commanded their respect. Like you can imagine, every dinner reception, he'd be the prize speaker of every Zoom conference. Mordechai, you're related to her. Unbelievable, right? He'd be their way in. Maybe you can help Mordechai. You can get us passports because, we have to work out getting it. Now, the queen, maybe you could put in a good word in the Homeland Security grant office, right? So you can imagine he would be, the big cheese because of his relationship. However, had he been proud and vain, had he boasted that he is a relation of the queen, the whole miracle would not have happened. The miracle was made possible by Mordechai's caution and humility. He was silent, humble. He was waiting for something to happen. He knew that the more fantastic the success story, the more vulnerable man is, and the more intense is the need for prayer. Vulnerability of man is proportionate to his greatness. The greater the success, the more vulnerable he is. Mordechai knew that if, as Esther climbed up to the very heights of success, the deeper became the abyss into which she might plunge. Because of Mordechai's humility and because of his awareness of vulnerability and caution, the great miracle happens. In some, vulnerability leads to humility, humility to caution, and caution leads to success. That's from Days of Deliverance. That a remarkable perspective? In other words, the whole idea of not revealing the identity of who Esther was and where her culture comes from wasn't as much a function of Esther as it was of Mordechai. In other words, this was really about the people connected to her not benefiting out of that connection. And it's so funny. You see this all the time when somebody is oile ligdula and worthy people who deserve to be there. Suddenly, everybody and their cousin wants to be connected to them. Autographs and I remember this when our friend and neighbor David Freeman became the ambassador. I remember it was the first Hanukkah right afterwards, and they had a candle lighting, Hanukkah candle lighting in the park. And David Freeman had always been lighting the menorah for Chabad for many, many years. He learns with Rabbi Wallowik. It's a wonderful thing. And that year that he became the ambassador, suddenly there was a huge crowd that everybody wanted to be there, to be connected, and to show that they had some sort of connection. And it was wonderful. And he did incredible things. It's just from the perspective of the bystander, the perspective of those who want to be more connected. Says Rosh Soloveitchik, Mordechai exercised humility because of the vulnerability over here, and that ultimately led to the success of the situation. Something worthwhile thinking. It's important over here sometimes, how much do we emphasize our identity or our connections? How important is it for us to show the whole world when sometimes it's better sometimes in stiller hate for things to develop at their own pace and at the appropriate time to emphasize connection. That's what the Rosh Soloveitchik suggests over here. I think a very, very, very telling and a very appropriate thing to think about. I would like to suggest as we close the loop, though, is at the end of the story, a very interesting thing happens. So she finds favor. She doesn't reveal her identity. She manages to keep this. I'd like to add one last perspective here, which is a fascinating perspective, and that is that Rav Alkabetz, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, who's also the author of Lecha Dodi, has a book called Manos HaLevi, which he wrote. It was actually published posthumously, I believe in 1585, on the Megillah. And in it, Rav Alkabetz makes a fascinating suggestion over here, where he points out that this story talks about essentially coercion. If you're thinking about the words that we used, even earlier on when we looked at Esther as being taken, the word used over here is Vatilokach Esther el Beis Hamelech, and she was taken, right? So that speaks of coercion. And in fact, the later words also describe it, how she was taken with coercion. Says the Manos HaLevi of Alkabetz that her not revealing her name emphasizes the coercion of the situation. Because from the perspective in retrospect, when we look at this afterwards and we say, wow, Esther was this great heroine, there will be people who will say, well, yeah, no, actually, she was in it for herself. She thought this was a great ticket, have a relationship with the king, and now you get to live in a palace, drive a Corvette, have servants every day. This is it. You've made it. And the Megillah is actually emphasizing exactly the opposite, both in the way that she was taken and even in the way that she dealt with those around her. Hegai is the most important person over here. You can imagine every girl's family who wants to have a queen in the family is probably sending him roses every Friday. And they want Hegai to set their girl up as the future queen. This is amazing. But Esther expresses the fact that she is, in fact, the victim of coercion, even the way she deals with Hegai as well. The Manos HaLevi points this out. This is a very important point in terms of Esther's relationship to power. It was not one of willingness. Finally, as the story concludes, looking at these four different perspectives, the story concludes with the following words. So we hear that the king finds great endearment and loves Esther dearly, and he chooses her. After choosing her, he makes this grand feast, one of many feasts in the Megillah. I'm sorry?
Is it possible to scroll down a little bit on the shared screen? We're still seeing source number 1.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I have. It seems to be slow. How about I'll do like this. Let me stop and start again, okay? and then we'll see if that works, okay? My screen is frozen. Okay, my apologies. It looks like I froze a little while back. Okay, there we go. I was talking to myself. I'm sorry. There we go. One second. Oops. 1 second. Let me see if I can screen. Yeah, here we go. Do it like this. Okay. Here we are. At the end of the story, we're told the following words: is that after this great feast happens, he makes this great feast for Esther. It's wonderful. He makes a tax benefit from all the people. And according to the bounty of the king, he gives gifts out. I mean, it's a grand festival for Esther. Amazing. What would you expect to be the next pasuk? What would you expect to be the next step of the story? I don't know. Her policies, Mordechai's relief. I don't know, something. So what is it that she achieved? Listen to the next pasuk. The king gathered all the girls a second time. And Mordechai is sitting in the gateway of the king. And then Esther and she's not telling anybody. That's a little strange. Why are the girls who've not yet met the king? Why are they being gathered a second time right now? Why are we being told Mordechai is in the gate to the king? And again, the emphasis on Esther not telling of her lineage. Very strange, don't you think? And I happened to come across a very beautiful suggestion from Rav Yehoshua Bachrach. Rav Yehoshua Bachrach is the author of many Svarim on Tanakh. One is called Kisvuni Ladoros, which is on this Megillah, and he makes a fascinating suggestion. He says maybe that's exactly what it's trying to say. Remember, Mordechai had not yet entered the Shar HaMelech. The Shar is the gate. Before now, the way that we found Mordechai was the only place he was Mordechai misalech lifnei chatzar beis hanashim. He spent the time outside the women's courtyard trying to see how Esther was. The first time we hear him in the gate is after this story. The gate actually is associated with power. The gate is associated with an office in the king's cabinet of some sort of justice or judge. Perhaps what's happening over here is that as Mordechai now sees that she's arriving in the right place, he feels that he needs to get closer to power. He needs to invest in the society and climb the ranks of the king's cabinet, perhaps to have the influence or to help with the influence that Esther is making. But now let's come back to that again. Why is the party happening? Why do we hear this tax break? Why do we hear about all these young ladies who are gathered a second time? So the Gemara tells us in Megillah an amazing thing. These are all leverage. Listen to this. The Gemara says in Megillah Yud Gimel, he made a great feast. Avad mishtaya v'lo galya lei. He made a great feast for her. He threw a ball second to none in order that she reveal where she comes from. She didn't reveal it. Dali kraga v'lo galya. He said, I'll make a tax break. It's going to affect all your brethren, your sisters, your brothers. Like she didn't reveal it. Shadar pardishne v'lo galyale. He sent out these gifts to all the ministers in her name. Meaning to say, he made it seem that she's doing so well. She still wouldn't reveal it. Then it goes on. Uvi kovetz b'sulois shenis. What's the next pasuk? He gathers the girls again. Azal shakal eitzam Mordechai. Amar ein isha miskano ela b'yerech chaverta. So he asks Mordechai for advice. And Mordechai says, maybe make her jealous. Maybe pretend that you're going to restart the process. And maybe out of jealousy for that place and role that she may have, she'll reveal to you. And she didn't. And that's the flow of the psukim. After all of these things, Esther's still not willing to reveal her morality, which is a remarkable perspective. Okay? And 1 second. So, So what happens is, I think this is a remarkable perspective here, is that under all this coercion is not coming from the gods, it's not coming from Haggai, it's coming from the king himself. Esther still remains strong. All the values that we talked about, where is the value of this is going to be more likely to have it rejected or more accepted, the Ibn Ezra Rashi. Whereas the idea of being a little more careful as an exiled Jew about your identity, like the Hamek Davar. Where this is an aspect of humility, like Rav Soloveitchik. Where this is an aspect of remaining not actively involved, but rather a victim of coercion, like Rav Alkabetz. whatever those values are that are important to her, or just simply listening to her father or her uncle or her husband, Mordechai, those values are so strong in her, she's not willing to even buckle under the pressure, under all this pressure, whether it be the carrot or the stick, which is being shoved in her direction. That explains the trajectory of Psukim, right? Here's the feast. That's the Mishnah Gadol. That's coercion number 1. Then we have Hanachal Amidinot, Asa, that's the tax break. That's coercion number 2. Then we have Masas B'Yad HaMelech, those are the gifts. That's coercion number 3. Then we have the girls being brought back together. That's coercion number 4. And still, the bottom line is Ein Esther Mageres Molanatov Esamo. She still sticks to her guns. She's not willing to disclose. That's how far it goes over here. Which leads us to a very fascinating, I would call, dialectic. And that is that in a couple prakim time, when genocide is slated and the nation of Israel stands to be completely obliterated, at such a point in time, Mordechai has to actually reverse this whole policy. And he has to beg her not to be silent. And we'll call it policy number 1 is now being reversed with great difficulty on Esther's part. It is at that point in time that, in fact, she has to not only reveal, but she has to be proud and willing to sacrifice her life based on who she is and where her culture comes from. It's perhaps this moment that's the turning point in the Megillah as to how it is that a Jew has to behave in a foreign culture. In this case, we're dealing with Persia as that foreign culture, but in many of the cultures that we've had, how successful are we supposed to be? How outwardly Jewish are we supposed to be? How proud, how careful must we be? How active in the political system must we be? How overtly active in the political system must we be? And the answer is complex. The answer seems to be that it depends on the time, it depends on the circumstance and opportunity. If it's or perhaps it's the time, as the Ha'amek Dava says, that we don't volunteer information, which is not necessarily going to be necessary. This is the beginning of the starting of this thought process. I'd like to conclude the Gemara, which actually continues over there at the top of the Yud Gimel Amud Aleph going to Yud Gimel Beis. The Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Elazar, Ma dichsev lo yigra mitzadek einov, that a tzaddik will never lose what he invested. Because Rachel was tzanua, then she begot Shaul. The tznius there refers to the fact that she did not volunteer that, in fact, that her sister was put in her place. And in the tznius that Shaul had, ultimately he begot Esther. And it's fascinating that these are all about withholding information, not taking the full credit for one's situation, even though one may be right or entitled to. And it's that balance which makes ultimately Esther the leader, knowing when to exercise this and knowing when not to exercise this. These are two perspectives, I think, which require a little bit more development, that I would submit are a fascinating description, a fascinating opening into our reality, the reality of diaspora Jews, following and trying to trail behind Esther Hamal. Any thoughts?